What if I told you that the key to unlocking your deepest empathy, your most profound capacity to understand another human being, has been hiding inside you since the beginning of your species? What if all these layers of modern identity, all this noise we call individuality, are actually muffling something ancient, something raw, primal, and shockingly intelligent? I remember the first time this realization hit me. It wasn't an idea, it wasn't a philosophy. It was like a memory from before I had a name, before I had a story. It felt like the echo of some ancient truth rising through the fog of modern life, whispering, "You were never meant to walk through this world alone." I realized that so much of what we call self-awareness is actually self-isolation. We build these walls, career walls, emotional walls, intellectual walls, because somewhere along the line, we were taught that being an individual is the highest form of evolution. But the more I looked around, the more I studied the spirals of consciousness, the more I listened to the rhythms of nature, the clearer it became we are not designed to exist as isolated islands. We are designed to resonate, to mirror, to feel into one another like an interconnected neural network of living primates bound by empathy. And the strange thing is, once you begin to notice this, you see it everywhere. You see it in the way a stranger glances at you with a hint of recognition. You see it in the way a child instinctively knows when someone is sad. You see it in the way your own body reacts when another person is in pain, as if their suffering is somehow entering your nervous system. That's not imagination. That's biology. That's evolution whispering through your blood. I remember sitting once, watching a group of primates, just ordinary monkeys, and suddenly it struck me. They weren't surviving through dominance or physical power. They survived through a complex web of emotional intelligence. Grooming rituals, shared food, warning calls, it was a continuous dance of empathy, responsibility, and connection. It was as if each individual was an extension of the others. And in that moment, I realized something uncomfortable about myself and about the culture I came from. We spend so much time trying to transcend our animal nature, trying to become hyper-optimized, hyper-logical, hyper-individual. Yet in that very attempt, we sever ourselves from the most ancient technology we possess the ability to feel together. And as I watched those primates, I felt my own mind cracking open. I felt this strange understanding settle in empathy isn't a moral choice. It's a survival mechanism encoded into us long before language, long before cities, long before the illusion of separateness. We carry this ancient blueprint inside us, but modern culture teaches us to resist it, to override it, to pretend that we are self-contained universes. But the truth is far more interesting, far more unsettling. You are not just you. You are the continuation of a long chain of beings who survived because they felt each other, because they listened, because they recognized their lives were entangled. But when I look at the world today, I see a strange contradiction. We are more connected technologically than any generation before us, yet internally we are more divided, more anxious, more lonely. I feel it whenever I walk into a crowded place, thousands of people physically close, yet emotionally miles apart. Everyone afraid to look too long, afraid to feel too deeply, afraid to show the vulnerability that makes us human. It strikes me as tragic, really. We've mistaken distance for strength. We've mistaken emotional numbness for clarity. We've mistaken isolation for individuality. And I began to ask myself, where did this illusion begin? When did we forget that empathy was our original form of intelligence? When did we decide that being disconnected was somehow superior? I don't think the answer lies in any historical moment. I think the answer lies in fear. The fear that if we open ourselves to another, we might dissolve a little. We might lose the hard edges of our identity. We might feel too much. And isn't that the great terror of the modern human? Feeling too much. But feeling too much is exactly what saved our species. Empathy wasn't a weakness, it was a compass. It told us who needed help, who posed a threat, which alliances were safe, and which relationships would keep the tribe alive another day. Empathy was our original survival software. And when I internalized that, something shifted inside me. It wasn't philosophical, it was visceral. I began to understand that the reason modern life feels so fragmented is because we are actively suppressing something that has been woven into our DNA for millions of years. I started to observe myself differently. Whenever I walked into a room, I noticed the subtle energetic exchanges happening beneath the surface, the micro-expressions, the shifts in posture, the quiet invitations and retreats. I realized I could feel other people almost before they spoke. And when I traced that ability back, through memory, through instinct, through intuition. It led not to some spiritual revelation, but to the primate inside me. The creature that once lived in a world where survival meant knowing the emotional weather of the tribe at every moment. That's when I understood McKenna's metaphor in a whole new way. He wasn't saying we should devolve or become animalistic. He was saying we should stop pretending that our primal wiring is a flaw. It's not a flaw, it's a map, a bridge, a key to a deeper dimension of human experience we've forgotten how to access. And as I let myself descend into that understanding, I noticed that my empathy didn't make me weak. It made me powerful. It sharpened my perception. It expanded my awareness. It connected me to people in a way that felt almost telepathic. Suddenly, I wasn't just observing the world. I was participating in it. I was part of the emotional ecosystem again, and the loneliness that had once lived in the background of my life quietly evaporated. But there was something else too, something even more profound. I realized that empathy doesn't simply connect us to the people around us. It connects us to something much larger, something ancient, something that moves through all living beings. When I allowed myself to feel others without resistance, I felt this extraordinary sense of belonging, not to a family, not to a culture, not even to the human species, but to life itself. And in that state, isolation becomes impossible. It becomes a myth. That's when it hit me with absolute clarity. We are not here to become isolated geniuses. We are here to become conscious participants in a shared mind, a shared story, a shared evolution. Our individuality is real, yes, but it's porous, it's permeable. It's meant to flow into the world, not barricade itself from it. And once you begin to live from that understanding, everything changes. Your relationships change. Your purpose changes. Your perception of yourself changes. You begin to see that empathy is not an emotional reaction. It's a form of intelligence, a higher intelligence, a symbiotic intelligence. And I knew in that moment that if we could remember this, if we could reclaim the primal wisdom buried in our biology, we could dissolve so much of the suffering that plagues the modern world. Not through ideology, not through doctrine, but through something much simpler, much older, much more human, the courage to feel each other again. And as that understanding settled deeper into me, I realized that empathy wasn't something I had to practice or learn the way modern culture teaches us. It wasn't a skill acquired through self-help books or carefully curated workshops. It was already functioning beneath the surface like an underground river waiting to break through the cracks of my conditioned mind. The more I allowed myself to lean into that current, the more I could feel something ancient waking up, something that had always been part of me, but had been buried under layers of noise, distraction, and survival strategies that no longer served any purpose in the world I lived in. It felt like brushing the dust off a forgotten instrument, only to discover it still held its original tone perfectly, waiting for my hands to bring it back to life. I could sense the shift inside my awareness. It felt like a widening of perception, as if my internal camera lens had gone from narrow focus to panoramic. I began to understand emotions not just as personal experiences, but as shared fields of energy moving through space, through bodies, through countless minds entangled in the same invisible network. I could walk into a room and feel the tension or the warmth before anyone said a word. I could sense the subtle vibrations of others' internal worlds, and I realized it wasn't mystical, it wasn't magical, it was primal. It was what my ancestors relied on long before language brought the illusion that communication happens only through words. The more I tuned into this, the more I could see how deeply disconnected modern humans have become from this natural intelligence. We live in environments designed to numb us. We move through routines that prioritize efficiency over connection. We place masks over our feelings to appear composed, strong, independent. Yet beneath all of that, the biological machinery of empathy is still running, still operating, still trying to guide us back to one another like a compass, refusing to forget where north is. I could feel that compass inside myself, bending the needle back toward the collective, pulling me into a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. And this realization didn't feel heavy, it felt liberating. It showed me that I didn't have to manufacture empathy. I only had to remove the barriers I had built around it. I had to stop resisting the instinct to feel deeply. I had to stop pretending that emotional sensitivity was a liability. Every time I allowed myself to feel without constraint, it was as if another layer of static interference fell away, revealing the clarity underneath. I became aware of how much I had been taught to hold myself at a distance, emotionally, socially, psychologically, as if distance was synonymous with safety. But the truth was the opposite. Distance had kept me trapped. Distance had kept me small. Distance had kept me numb. As I leaned into this rediscovery, I noticed another shift. I became more aware of how interconnected my internal experiences were with the world around me. A ripple in someone else's mood could move through me like a passing breeze. A moment of shared laughter could uplift a space the way light transforms a dark room. I realized that empathy doesn't only help us understand others, it expands the dimensions of our own inner world. It shows us where we end and where we continue through the lives we touch. It reveals that the boundary of the self is softer than we think, more fluid, more permeable. And this permeability isn't a weakness, it's the very structure of our emotional biology. The deeper I went into this, the more I could see how much modern society fears this permeability. We are conditioned to believe that strength means being unaffected, untouched, unmoved by the world. We're told to stay in our lane, to mind our own business, to protect our energy, to the point where we disconnect from the very life force that sustains us. I realize that this fear of connection is not natural, it is learned, it is constructed, it is a story we inherited from a culture that prioritized survival in a world of scarcity. But we no longer live in those worlds, and yet the psychological residue remains, convincing us that vulnerability is synonymous with danger. But vulnerability is simply the doorway through which empathy enters. Without vulnerability, empathy has no place to land. Without openness, the emotional network that once held tribes together collapses into fragments. And in those fragments, isolation breeds. I could feel how that isolation had quietly shaped my own life for years. I had mistaken intellectual independence for emotional separation. I had mistaken strong boundaries for armored walls. I had mistaken self-reliance for disconnection. And as I began dismantling those internal structures, I could feel the raw, pulsating truth beneath them, a truth that had been waiting all along for my willingness to return to it. It became clear to me that empathy is not a response to others. It is an expression of our natural state of being. When I allowed myself to sink fully into that natural state, I felt this incredible sense of coherence. Like all the fragmented versions of myself were finally aligning. The defensive self, the isolated self, the performative self, they began dissolving as the deeper, older self emerged. A self that understood connection not as a choice, but as a fundamental condition of existence. A self that had never forgotten its place within the tribe of living beings. This change didn't make me softer in the way society defines softness. It made me sharper. It heightened my awareness, my intuition, my ability to read situations, to feel truth, to sense intentions. I realized empathy wasn't about absorbing others' emotions. It was about perceiving the flow of human energy with clarity and depth. It was intelligence, ancient intelligence, the same intelligence that kept early primates alive long before the structures of civilization appeared. And once I recognized this, I began to see the cracks in our modern worldview. We have mistaken emotional sensitivity for fragility. We have mistaken interdependence for weakness. We have mistaken detachment for strength. These illusions have cost us more than we realize. With every step I took into this deeper awareness, I could feel myself shedding those illusions. It was like walking out of a dimly lit room into the brilliance of the sun. I could feel the shift in my interactions. Conversations became richer, more alive. Not because I was trying harder, but because I was present in a way I hadn't been before. I was no longer observing from behind a psychological barrier. I was participating with my whole being. And in that participation, I felt a sense of belonging that wasn't dependent on approval or validation. It came from the simple act of showing up as an empathetic human, attuned to the shared emotional fabric around me. The more I embraced this, the more I realized that empathy is the bridge between the inner world and the outer world. It is the connection point where your personal narrative meets the collective narrative. It is the doorway that allows you to feel your life not as an isolated event, but as part of a greater unfolding. And once you begin to live from that space, the world becomes less threatening and more intimate. People become less mysterious and more familiar. Life becomes less fragmented and more whole. There's a kind of quiet power that emerges from this state of being, not the power that dominates or controls, but the power that understands, that resonates, that harmonizes with the emotional field of others. It is the power of presence, the power of awareness, the power of being attuned to the subtle patterns that shape every human interaction. And when you carry that power within you, you become something more than an individual. You become part of the collective intelligence of humanity. You become a participant in the emotional evolution of the species. You become a conduit for the ancient wisdom that has been flowing through primates long before we learned to name ourselves. And in that participation, something extraordinary awakens, the sense that you are no longer walking through life as a solitary consciousness, but as an expression of something larger, something shared, something deeply interconnected. It is the remembrance of who you were before you became who you are. It is the reawakening of the symbiotic self. And as that remembrance deepened in me, I began to sense that the boundaries of my identity were loosening, not dissolving in a chaotic way, but opening into a larger sphere of perception that felt more truthful than anything I had known before. It was as if the self I had spent years constructing was merely a temporary shelter, a structure built from cultural expectations, personal fears, and the narratives I had inherited without question. And as those layers thinned, I could feel something more expansive emerging, something that didn't need validation or protection, because it wasn't separate in the first place. It was connected to a current of awareness that seemed to stretch backwards through evolution and forward into the future, linking everything in a single continuous stream. This shift was not an escape from individuality, it was an expansion of it. I could feel my consciousness widening to include the subtle emotional frequencies of the people around me. I could sense their internal worlds not as foreign territories, but as extensions of my own experience, like branches of the same ancient root system. The more I embraced this interconnectedness, the more I realized that empathy is not simply an emotional function, it is a sensory organ. It allows us to perceive the invisible architecture of human connection, the silent language that operates underneath words and gestures. This language had always been there, but I had been too wrapped in my own pursuit of separateness to hear it clearly. The deeper I went, the more I noticed the textures of other people's emotions blending with my own. Not in a way that overwhelmed me, but in a way that gave me clarity. I could feel how much pain people carry silently. I could feel the loneliness hidden behind confident expressions, the quiet longing beneath polished identities, the confusion masked by business and noise. I realized that beneath every interaction, no matter how casual, there is a shared human story unfolding, a story of beings trying to make sense of themselves in a world that has forgotten how to honor the emotional truth of existence. In that recognition, something inside me softened. I felt a kind of compassion that wasn't rooted in pity or sympathy, but in understanding. Understanding that every person I encountered was navigating their own internal maze. Understanding that their struggles didn't make them weak, they made them human. Understanding that the walls they built were not barriers against me, but shields against a world that had taught them to fear vulnerability. And in that realization, I felt my own walls become unnecessary. They had protected me once, but now they only divided me from a deeper connection to life. As I allowed those walls to fall away, I began to experience a strange sense of freedom. A freedom that didn't come from doing whatever I wanted, but from finally feeling the world in its full complexity without retreating into numbness. I could feel the collective heartbeat of humanity, the pulse of millions of inner lives intersecting in ways too intricate to fully comprehend. And within that complexity, there was a sense of unity that felt more real than any ideology or belief system I had ever encountered. It was the unity of shared experience, shared emotion, shared evolution. A unity that didn't erase differences but wove them together into a larger tapestry. This shift in perception changed the way I moved through the world. I became more attuned to the subtle signals people sent out unconsciously. The brief flicker of vulnerability in their eyes, the tremor in their voice when they spoke about something that mattered, the way their body held tension when they were carrying too much alone. I realized that empathy isn't about stepping into someone else's shoes. It's about recognizing that your feet were never separate from their path. There is no distance between you and the emotional world of another when you stop pretending that you are isolated. The more I embraced this interconnected perception, the more I understood how deeply the illusion of separateness had shaped modern life. We navigate the world as if we are solitary consciousnesses trapped within individual bodies, when in reality we are porous, interconnected, influenced by and influencing everything around us. We absorb emotions through the smallest gestures, the briefest encounters, the faintest expressions. We carry pieces of each other without realizing it. The emotional network we share is constantly transmitting signals, constantly creating patterns, constantly shaping the direction of the collective experience. As I tuned into these patterns, I could feel that empathy wasn't just something occurring between individuals. It was something emerging from the collective field itself. It was like a frequency that rose and fell in response to the emotional climate of humanity. When people were disconnected, the frequency weakened. When people embraced vulnerability and presence, the frequency strengthened. And I realized I could feel this frequency in my body, as if my nervous system had become a receiver for the emotional state of the world. This wasn't overwhelming, it was illuminating. It showed me that we are not separate minds, but interconnected nodes in a vast ecosystem of awareness, and with that awareness came a sense of responsibility, not a burden, but a clarity that my actions, my presence, my emotional transparency contributed to the collective field. If I moved through the world numb, disconnected, guarded, I added to the static. But if I moved through the world open, empathetic, attuned, I amplified the frequency of connection. This realization gave every interaction a new kind of depth. It wasn't about being perfect or enlightened. It was about showing up with authenticity. It was about being willing to feel the world rather than hide from it. As I lived with this clarity, I began to notice that my perception of others expanded beyond the surface level. I could sense their histories in the way they breathed, their fears in the way they hesitated, their hopes in the way their eyes flickered when they spoke about dreams they weren't sure they deserved. I became aware of how many people carry invisible wounds that no one has ever acknowledged. Wounds not from dramatic events, but from years of subtle disconnect, years of not being truly seen, heard, or understood. And as I became aware of this, I felt a deeper call to meet people with presence, to be a space where they didn't have to perform, defend, or pretend, a space where their humanity was recognized without judgment. This wasn't something I tried to do. It was something that happened naturally as I aligned myself with that ancient empathic intelligence. I realized that when you are truly present with someone, you don't just hear their words, you feel their essence. You sense the part of them that has been waiting quietly and patiently for someone to notice. And when that part is acknowledged, something shifts in them. You can see it in their eyes, in their posture, in the way they exhale a breath they didn't know they were holding. It is the softening that happens when a human being feels understood at a level that bypasses language entirely. This understanding transformed my sense of what it means to be alive. I no longer saw life as a personal journey with occasional interactions. I saw it as a collective unfolding in which every moment of empathy, every act of presence, every connection made beneath the surface contributes to the evolution of consciousness itself. I felt myself participating in something far larger than my individual life, something ancient, something ongoing, something that had been guiding primates long before humans carved symbols into cave walls or built cities that scraped the sky. It was the same force that pushed tribes to survive together, that shaped the early roots of cooperation, that molded the emotional architecture of our species. And as I embraced that force, I began to understand that empathy is not an evolutionary accident. It is the foundation of our humanity. It is the intelligence that allowed primates to form communities, protect each other, and build the foundations upon which civilization stands. The fact that modern society treats empathy as optional or secondary is not a sign of progress, but a sign of amnesia. An amnesia that has led us to build brilliant external systems while neglecting the internal system that made those systems possible in the first place. As that realization deepened, I felt myself stepping into a different relationship with the world. I no longer felt like an observer of humanity. I felt like a participant in its unfolding story. I could feel the emotional currents that shaped collective behavior, the silent struggles that influenced individual choices, the unspoken longing that moved through people like an underground river waiting to surface. And in that feeling, I recognized that empathy is the bridge between the inner and the outer, the personal and the collective, the ancient and the future. It is the thread that weaves consciousness into connection. That's where the deeper truth begins to reveal itself, because once you've recognized that your inner world is not a prison but a portal, something inside you shifts in a way that can never be reversed again. You begin to realize that every moment of confusion, every episode of doubt, every internal contradiction was never a flaw in your system. It was the system trying to evolve you. Growth isn't something you do. Growth is something you surrender to. And when you finally surrender, The boundaries of who you think you are begin to dissolve like sand slipping through open fingers. You start to notice how the old patterns lose their gravity. The behaviors that once felt inevitable now appear flimsy, almost transparent. You no longer rush to protect your defenses, because you begin to understand that defensiveness is nothing more than a relic of an outdated identity. You're not fighting the world anymore. You're outgrowing the war. And the quiet realization that you don't have to respond to life with the same tired patterns becomes the beginning of your liberation. As this new awareness unfolds, the world doesn't suddenly become easier, but you become different, and that difference alters everything. The noise is still there, the chaos still vibrates in the background. The expectations of society still tug at your attention, yet none of it holds you the way it once did. You begin to operate from a center that is no longer reactive but deeply rooted. You feel your consciousness taking shape in ways you had never allowed before. The mind starts to cooperate with you instead of sabotaging you. The storms come, but instead of drowning in them, you become the one who watches them with an almost serene fascination. This is where a deeper transformation begins, when you step beyond the shallow desire to simply feel better and enter the realm of wanting to understand. Because understanding is transcendence. Understanding is evolution. Understanding is awakening. When you understand your own mind, your fears, your patterns, your desires, and your shadows, you begin to hold yourself from a vantage point that is almost cosmic. You see the architecture of your life with a clarity that feels both humbling and empowering. You finally understand that your wounds were never meant to weaken you. They were the pressure points through which your consciousness was trying to awaken. And as this awareness grows stronger, the meaning of your struggles begins to shift. What once felt like punishment now feels like initiation. What once felt like chaos now feels like recalibration. What once felt like abandonment now feels like redirection. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and begin asking, "What is this trying to awaken in me?" And that shift in question rewires your entire perception of reality. Your relationship with discomfort transforms. Instead of avoiding it, you sit with it. Instead of fearing it, you observe it. Instead of resisting it, you listen to it. You start to realize that discomfort is not your enemy, but your teacher. It's the coded message life sends you whenever it wants you to evolve. It's the whisper of transformation disguised as pressure. It's the doorway to the next version of you, hidden behind the illusion of pain. And when you finally stop running, when you finally turn and face the things you've avoided for years, something extraordinary happens. The fear loses its form, it melts. It reveals itself as nothing more than a misunderstanding you carried for too long. The monster dissolves into a mirror. You see that the things you feared were only fragments of you that were misunderstood, unloved, and unintegrated. This integration becomes the beginning of an entirely new life. Suddenly you feel an inner coherence, a kind of psychological alignment that you didn't even know was possible. The inner war quiets. The conflicts soften. The doubts no longer dominate. You find yourself acting with clarity and choosing with intention. Even your voice changes, calmer, slower, more grounded. People notice the difference before you do. They sense that something in your presence has changed, something subtle yet undeniable. You are no longer someone being pulled by life. You are someone guiding it. And in this space, something profound emerges, a quiet internal authority, not the kind that seeks control, but the kind that radiates authenticity. You stop apologizing for being yourself. You stop negotiating your worth. You stop shrinking to make others comfortable. You stop confusing silence with peace and chaos with passion. You begin to embody a grounded confidence that cannot be faked and cannot be stolen, because it is rooted not in the world around you, but in the world within you. This internal authority grows with every choice you make from your deeper self rather than your conditioned self. You begin to understand that authenticity isn't about expressing everything you feel. It's about expressing what is aligned with your truth. And as your authenticity strengthens, your relationships shift. Some dissolve, others deepen, and entirely new ones emerge. People who resonated with your old patterns fall away, and people aligned with your new frequency appear. It's not loss. It's space reorganizing itself around the person you're becoming. As you evolve, your vision begins to expand. You start seeing possibilities where before you saw barriers. You start seeing potential in situations you once dismissed. The world begins to look less like a battlefield and more like an unfolding mystery. You become aware that every moment has a hidden layer, Every experience carries a message. Every encounter contains an invitation. Life starts speaking to you through synchronicities, intuitions, inner urgings, and sudden clarity. You develop a sensitivity that feels almost otherworldly, a sensitivity that alerts you when something is aligned and warns you when it is not. And then comes one of the most powerful realizations of all. You understand that you were never broken. You were never behind. You were never lost. You were evolving through a terrain your mind couldn't yet interpret. You were walking the path your deeper self had chosen long before your conscious mind caught up. Every detour, every mistake, every heartbreak, every confusion, they weren't deviations. They were essential steps in the blueprint of your transformation. They shaped the version of you who can now stand tall in your truth. As this truth settles inside you, something shifts in the way you move through the world. You begin to choose presence over speed, depth over noise, meaning over validation. You stop trying to be everything for everyone and begin focusing on becoming whole within yourself. You no longer chase purpose in the external world. You begin uncovering it from within your inner landscape. Purpose stops feeling like a destination and becomes an expression of your expanding consciousness. And this is where the transformation reaches its peak. You understand that life is not asking you to have everything figured out. Life is asking you to stay awake, to stay aware, to stay connected to the evolution unfolding inside you. Because when you are awake, even uncertainty becomes meaningful. Even endings become beginnings. Even chaos becomes creative. You start to trust the process, not blindly, but deeply, because you feel the intelligence within every moment guiding you forward. This trust becomes your compass. It carries you through transitions, through losses, through breakthroughs, through reinventions. You begin to realize that you don't need to know the entire path to take the next step. You don't need to predict the future to grow into it. You don't need the approval of others to step into your authenticity. You simply need to stay aligned with the truth that emerges from within you. As your awareness expands even further, you begin to sense the deeper layers of existence. You notice how every experience carries a frequency, how every thought shapes your reality, how every choice influences the path ahead. You feel the interconnectedness of all things, not as a spiritual theory, but as an undeniable inner knowing. You begin to operate from a place where intuition and logic work together, where emotion and clarity merge into wisdom. This is the point where human consciousness touches something almost sacred. And from this sacred awareness grows the most powerful conclusion of your journey, that your consciousness is not something you possess, it is something you are. It is the source of your freedom, the architect of your transformation, the silent guide that has been shaping your evolution from the beginning. When you finally recognize this, you no longer seek meaning in temporary experiences. You begin to create meaning from your presence. You no longer chase answers, you become the space where answers appear. This is where you step into the final understanding that life is not happening to you or against you. It is happening through you. Your consciousness is the canvas. Your choices are the brush. Your experiences are the colors. And your evolution is the masterpiece being painted with every moment you live. The more awake you are, the more beautiful the painting becomes. The more present you are, the more intentional the strokes become. The more authentic you are, the more vibrant the masterpiece becomes. And so, the journey that once felt chaotic begins to reveal its order. The confusion begins to reveal its purpose. The pain begins to reveal its message. The silence begins to reveal its wisdom. And the path you once walked blindly becomes illuminated by the very consciousness that grew from your struggles. This is the conclusion, not an ending, but a transformation into a higher way of being. You are no longer the person shaped by your past. You are the person shaping your future. You are no longer the seeker. You are the awakened participant in your own evolution. Every step forward from this moment is a step taken with awareness, with intention, with presence, and with the inner knowing that you are aligned with the truth of who you are becoming. Your story does not end here. It begins here, reborn, renewed, and rewritten by the consciousness you have awakened.